My name is Elizabeth Hollis. I am 29 years old. I am a second-year emergency medicine resident at a hospital in Pittsburgh, and I want to tell you about the morning a postal worker walked into my father's deli and handed me the letter that should have arrived 7 years ago. It was a Tuesday in October. I was behind the register at Hollis Deli on Prospect Avenue in Cleveland, the same counter I had worked since I was 14 years old. The morning rush had thinned. 3 regulars nursed coffee at the far end. The fluorescent strip above the cold case hummed the way it always had, a low, slightly off-pitch sound I had stopped hearing years before. The deli smelled the way it always smelled, cured meat and vinegar, and the faint sweetness of the bread rolls my father restocked every morning at 6. I was filling a condiment tray when the front door opened and Gerald Webb walked in. General was 58 years old and had been the USPS carrier on our street for 19 years. He wore his postal uniform with the same straightforward reliability he brought to everything. Dark pants, the blue jacket with the emblem on the shoulder, a canvas satchel over one arm. He came into the deli occasionally for coffee, and he passed by the window each morning around 10 on his route. I knew his face the way you know the faces of people who are simply part of the reliable structure of a neighborhood, present and consistent and not requiring much thought. That morning, he walked to the counter without stopping at the coffee station. He set his satchel down and reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and placed an envelope on the counter in front of me. He said, "This is addressed to you. I wanted to make certain you received it personally." The return address read, Hartfield University School of Medicine, Office of Admissions, Columbus, Ohio. I did not pick it up right away. I looked at it the way you look at something that your brain has already recognized, but your body has not yet caught up with. Gerald did not move. The 3 regulars at the far end of the counter had gone quiet, in the way people go quiet when they sense something shifting in a room. I picked up the envelope and opened it. The letter was 2 pages on Hartfield letterhead. The first line of the first paragraph read, "Dear Ms. Hollis, this communication serves as a formal follow-up to our offer of admission." I read it twice. Then I set it on the counter, face up, where anyone standing at the register could read it without squinting. My father, Dennis Hollis, came out from the back office at precisely that moment. He had heard the silence. Silence in a deli has a specific quality, different from noise, and Dennis had spent 30 years reading this particular room. He came through the doorway wiping his hands on a dish towel, and he looked at me, and then he looked at the envelope on the counter, and he looked at the return address, and his hands stopped moving. He knew what that envelope was. He knew, because he had held one exactly like it 7 months earlier, carried it to the back office, read it alone, and then taken it to the kitchen and held a lit match over the sink until it was gone. He told me that day it was a rejection letter. He said, "These things happen." He said I should think seriously about what I wanted to do with my life, because the deli was real and stable and mine if I wanted it. What he did not say was that the letter said, "Congratulations," that Hartfield had accepted me into their incoming class, that the life I had been building toward in every pre-dawn study session, every organic chemistry exam, every MCAT practice test I took at this same counter between customers, had been waiting for me on the other side of that envelope, and he had burned it in a kitchen sink to make sure I never knew. Gerald Webb stood 4 feet away and did not say a word. He had driven 40 miles to Columbus on his day off to make this moment possible. He was not going to interrupt it. How old were you the first time someone who was supposed to protect you made a decision about your future without asking you? Leave your answer in the comments below. And if this is your first time here, welcome to Sophia Told Stories. Stay with me, because what happened next in that deli, in front of those customers, with my father standing there and the letter face up on the counter, is the part of this story that I have needed 7 years to be ready to tell. Let me take you back to the beginning, to a house in Cleveland, to a counter I never chose, and to the father who decided his plans for me were more important than the ones I had made for myself. The deli came before everything. before the house on Crestwood Drive, before my parents' marriage, before my father had a plan for any of us. Hollis Deli on Prospect Avenue had been open since 1987, built by my grandfather Raymond Hollis out of a gutted hardware store and 30 years of stubbornness, and passed to my father Dennis the year I turned 6. Dennis did not inherit a business. He inherited an identity. The deli was not something he ran. It was something he was, and that distinction shaped every decision he made for the next 2 decades, including the ones he made about me. Dennis Hollis was 54 years old that October morning when Gerald Webb walked through the front door. He was a compact man with calloused hands and a way of standing with his weight slightly forward, as if bracing for something, that he carried everywhere, at the counter, at the dinner table, in the bleachers at my brother Tyler's high school basketball games. He had not finished college. He talked about that occasionally, not with regret, but with a particular pride reframed as practicality, the suggestion that people who stayed close to real work understood something that educated people did not. The deli was his proof. It had fed us, paid the mortgage, put a used car in the driveway, and kept the Hollis name on a sign on Prospect Avenue for 35 years. That was the argument he made. Not with words usually, but with the schedule he posted on the refrigerator every Sunday night, and the way he handed me an apron the week I turned 14 without asking whether I wanted one. My mother Patricia worked 3 days a week at a dental office on West 117th Street, scheduling appointments and handling insurance calls. She was 52 and had the kind of careful, measured presence of someone who has spent years reading a room before entering it. She was not absent. She attended every school event, remembered the names of my teachers, packed lunches with the same reliable consistency she brought to everything in her life. But she had learned, somewhere along the way, early enough that I never saw the moment it happened, that pushing back against Dennis cost more than it returned. So she did not push. She moved around his decisions the way water moves around a stone, finding the path of least friction, and she called that peace. I called it something else, but I did not have the words for it until much later. My brother Tyler was 3 years younger than me and had never once worked a shift at the deli. Not because he was incapable, because Dennis never required it. Tyler had basketball practice on Tuesdays and Thursdays. Tyler had plans with his friends on Saturday mornings. Tyler was tired after school. Tyler would get to it eventually. The reasons rotated, but the result was fixed. Tyler's afternoons were his own, and mine belonged to the counter. I watched this arrangement function for years without a single conversation about whether it was fair, because in our house, fairness was not a category Dennis recognized when applied to himself. He recognized hard work and obligation and loyalty to the family name. Those were his categories, and in his accounting, they applied to me with a specificity that somehow never reached my brother. I want to be precise about what the deli cost, not in hours, though the hours were real enough. 14 to 18 years old, weekday evenings after school until close, full days on Saturdays, split shifts on Sundays during the summer. The counter work itself was not difficult. What it cost was the other thing. The time I did not have for the science fair project I wanted to build, the biology club that met Tuesday afternoons, the study group that formed after my AP chemistry class in junior year that I could not attend because I had a 4 o'clock shift. These were not catastrophic losses individually. Together, they formed a pattern, a wall built one small brick at a time between where I was and where I could see myself going. I was 16 the first time someone outside my family named what they saw in me. My biology teacher, Mrs. Whitfield, kept me after class one afternoon in November to return a lab report I had done on enzyme activity. She had given it a grade of 97, and she had written a single sentence at the bottom of the last page in red ink. "You think like a diagnostician. Have you considered medicine?" I folded the paper and put it in my bag and walked to the deli for my 4 o'clock shift and did not tell anyone for 3 days. When I eventually mentioned it at dinner, carefully, without the grade attached, just Mrs. Whitfield's comment about medicine. Dennis looked up from his plate and said that doctors made their living off people who were already suffering, and that he did not see anything honorable in that. He said it without heat, the way he said most things, as a statement of settled fact rather than an opinion open to discussion. Patricia passed the bread rolls. Tyler asked if there was any more of the roasted chicken. The conversation moved on, and I finished my dinner and did my dishes and went to my room and took out the lab report and read Mrs. Whitfield's sentence again in the quiet. That winter, I started staying up past midnight to study. I had discovered that the hours between 11 and 2 were the only ones in the house that belonged entirely to me. Dennis was asleep by 10. Patricia followed by 10:30. Tyler's room went dark around 11. The house settled into its nighttime sounds, the furnace cycling, the occasional car on Crestwood Drive, and I sat at my desk with my chemistry textbook and my biology notes, and the particular focused stillness of someone who has found the only uninterrupted time in their day and intends to use every minute of it. One morning in February of that junior year, I came downstairs at 6 to start my shift prep before school, and Dennis was already at the kitchen table with his coffee. He looked at me and said I looked tired and that I should stop loading myself down with so many advanced classes because it was affecting my energy at the deli. He said it in the same practical tone he used to discuss restocking schedules and supplier deliveries. He was not trying to be unkind. He was telling me, in the clearest language available to him, where my energy was supposed to go and what it was supposed to serve. I poured my coffee and said I would try to get more sleep. I did not stop taking the classes. That was the first decision I made that ran directly against the plan he had for me, and I made it without announcing it, without a confrontation, without any of the drama that might have given him the opportunity to shut it down. I just kept showing up at the counter on time and getting my shifts done and going home and studying until midnight. And I let him believe the two things were compatible because he needed to believe that and I needed the grades. By the time I was a senior, I had a 4.1 GPA, 2 AP science credits, and a quiet certainty about the direction I was heading that I had not shared with anyone in my house. I had shared it with exactly one person outside it, and she had written about it in red ink on a lab report I still had in my desk drawer. I applied to Cleveland State University on a full academic scholarship. Dennis thought I was taking general education courses because I had not told him I was pre-med. I had learned by then that the information I gave him was information he could use against me. What I had not learned yet was how far he was willing to go. Cleveland State University sent my acceptance letter in late March of my senior year of high school. I read it standing at the kitchen counter while Dennis was at the deli and Patricia was at work, and I held it for a moment before folding it carefully and putting it in the folder I kept at the back of my closet, where I stored things I did not want discussed at dinner. The scholarship covered full tuition. I had applied without telling anyone, filled out the FAFSA in my room late at night, listed my own email address for all correspondence, and arranged to have the acceptance and financial aid notifications sent directly to me. I had learned that lesson from watching how information moved through our household, which was to say, it moved toward Dennis and stopped there. I started at Cleveland State in September. I told Dennis I was taking general education courses while I figured out a direction. He accepted this because it aligned with his understanding of what college was, a place young people went to be uncertain in, and because I had agreed to keep working the deli on the same schedule we had always kept. Weekday evenings 4 to close, Saturdays 7 to 3, Sundays when needed. He did not ask about my classes. I did not offer details. The arrangement held. What he did not know, and what I worked carefully to keep from him through 4 years of coursework, was that I had declared a pre-med track in my first week of registration. Biology, chemistry, biochemistry, physiology, genetics, statistics. I carried a yellow legal pad everywhere in those years, not for notes, but for scheduling. The page divided into 1-hour blocks from 6 in the morning to midnight, each block assigned a function: class, lab, deli shift, study, meal. There was rarely a block left unassigned, and the ones that were tended to fill themselves anyway with the overflow from the ones before. I became efficient in the specific way that people become efficient when they understand that time is a resource that is being spent whether they are paying attention or not. Patricia asked how my classes were going roughly once a semester, usually over dinner when Dennis was distracted by the television in the other room. I told her things were going well. She nodded and said that was good to hear. She did not retain the specifics from one conversation to the next, and after a while I stopped offering them, not from resentment, but from the simple recognition that the information did not have anywhere to land. Tyler asked me twice in my college years to cover his shifts. Both times, I did it. Not because I felt obligated, or not only because of that, but because saying no required a conversation with Dennis that would have cost more time and energy than the shift itself. Tyler thanked me both times in the easy, unbothered way of someone who expected the answer would be yes and was mildly pleased to be right. He was not calculating about it. He simply lived inside a set of rules that had always bent in his direction, and he had never had cause to question whether they bent for everyone. The first time Gerald Webb asked what I was reading, I had a biochemistry textbook open on the counter beside the register. It was a Monday morning in October of my sophomore year. He dropped the business mail on the counter the way he always did, a rubber-banded stack of invoices and supplier envelopes, and paused when he saw the book. He asked what the subject was. I told him biochemistry. He said his daughter had started a nursing program at a community college 2 years earlier. I waited for more. He said she stopped halfway through. He said it quietly and did not add anything after it, no explanation, no reason given, and I understood from the way he said it that the reason was not his to offer. After that morning, he began leaving the deli's mail directly with me rather than in the front slot, a small adjustment that saved him 40 seconds on his route, but that told me something about the kind of attention he paid. We talked in the way that people talk when they see each other briefly every weekday morning for years. A few sentences, a question, an answer, nothing forced. He learned over time that I was pre-med, that I was working toward medical school, that I studied at the counter during slow stretches. He asked occasionally about an exam the week after I had mentioned one, not to check on me, but in the way of someone who had been listening and remembered. He did not make a project of it. He just paid attention, which in those years was rarer than it should have been. The MCAT preparation began the second semester of my junior year. I had researched the timeline carefully. The test should be taken in the spring of junior year to allow applications to go out in the fall before senior year, which meant 18 months of dedicated preparation running parallel to my full course load and the deli schedule. I bought the prep materials used from a student in my organic chemistry class who had already taken the exam. I downloaded Anki on my phone and built flashcard decks for every content area: biochemistry, psychology, critical reasoning, physical sciences. During slow stretches at the deli counter, I propped my phone against the register and ran through cards between customers, the kind of studying that looks like nothing from the outside, but accumulates if you do it every day without exception. I took the MCAT in April of my junior year. I did not tell anyone at home that I was taking it. I told them I had an early Saturday shift at a different location, which was not a story that required maintenance because Dennis never called to check. I drove myself to the testing center in my own car, sat for 7.5 hours across 2 sections, drove home, worked the Sunday shift the next day, and waited 6 weeks for the score report. When it came to my email, I opened it in the deli parking lot before my evening shift. My score was in the 89th percentile. I sat in my car for 4 minutes. Then I clocked in. I applied to 8 medical schools in October of my senior year. All 8 were in Ohio or neighboring states, within driving distance of Cleveland, because I had enough practical sense to know that financial aid packaging and proximity to work mattered as much as prestige. Hartfield University School of Medicine in Columbus was my first choice, 40 miles south, a strong emergency medicine residency program, a history of admitting students from state schools when their academic records were competitive. My academic record was competitive. I had a 3.87 GPA, the MCAT score, 2 years of hospital volunteering I had arranged on my own through a contact at a Cleveland clinic, and 3 strong letters of recommendation from professors who had known me since freshman year. I uploaded the last application on a Wednesday night in early October and closed my laptop and went to bed. Then I waited. Every pre-med student knows this kind of waiting, the weeks after applications go out when there is nothing left to do but show up and keep working and try not to check email at 2 in the morning. I kept working the deli. I finished my senior coursework. I studied for finals. I did not tell Dennis I had applied. I did not tell Tyler. I told Patricia one Sunday morning when we were alone in the kitchen, and she listened and then said she hoped it went well, and she squeezed my hand briefly on the counter, the smallest gesture, and went back to her coffee. The response period for medical schools runs from October through April. Hartfield's admissions office typically notified accepted applicants in late February. I had written the date on my legal pad. I watched the calendar the way you watch something you cannot control but cannot stop measuring. February arrived. I kept working. I kept waiting. The mail slot at the front of the deli rattled every morning around 11:47, and every morning Dennis came out from the back to check it, and every morning I watched him sort through the stack, and every morning nothing changed. Until the morning, everything did. The letter came on a Thursday. I know it was a Thursday because I had the lunch shift, which meant I was behind the register from 11 to 3, and Thursdays were the days the produce supplier delivered, which meant Dennis spent the first hour of the afternoon in the back office cross-referencing the delivery invoice against what had actually arrived. I know the time because I had looked at the clock above the cold case at 11:43 and thought that if anything from Hartfield was coming this week, it would be in the late February batch, and this was the last Thursday of the month. I was not obsessing over it. I had simply been aware of it, the way you are aware of a slow pain that you have learned to carry alongside everything else. The mail slot at the front of the deli was positioned beside the door, cut through the lower section of the wall at a height convenient for Gerald Webb's route. Mail arrived between 11:30 and noon, depending on where we fell in his sequence. The slot clicked and rattled, and the stack landed on the small shelf mounted below it with a sound I had heard every working day for 8 years. I was filling a sandwich order when it happened. I heard Dennis come out of the back office, which was his routine, and I heard him pick up the stack and begin sorting through it the way he always did, billing envelopes to the left, supplier correspondence to the right, anything personal set aside for the counter. I did not look up immediately. I finished the sandwich, wrapped it, called the customer's number, and then turned to the counter to take the next order. That was when I saw Dennis's hands. He had stopped sorting. He was holding a single envelope away from the rest of the stack, his thumb and forefinger on the upper left corner, the way you hold something you are reading carefully. I could not see the return address from where I stood, 6 feet away, but I saw the envelope itself. It was larger than a billing notice, thicker, a brighter white than the standard business mail we received, the kind of stock that institutions use for formal correspondence. He stood there with it for a moment that lasted longer than a moment. Then he turned and walked back toward the office without saying anything. I took 3 more orders. Each one required my full attention, and I gave it, because the only thing I had ever been able to control in that deli was the quality of the work I did while I was there. I made the sandwiches. I ran the register. I answered a question about the soup of the day. I watched the clock above the cold case move from 11:52 to 12:04 to 12:19. I did not go to the back office. I waited. Dennis came out at 12:27. I know because I looked at the clock the moment I heard the office door. He walked to the counter and set a torn envelope down in front of me. The envelope was empty and already open, the flap ragged, and the return address in the upper left corner read, Hartfield University School of Medicine, Office of Admissions. He said the letter from Hartfield had come. He said it came with the morning mail. He said the word rejection the way he said the word invoice. One more piece of information being processed and filed, nothing requiring particular handling. He said these things happened and that a lot of qualified people did not get in on the first application, and she should think about what she really wanted from this and whether medical school was the right direction. He said the deli was real and steady, and the job was hers if she wanted to build something with it. He said all of this, looking at the counter rather than at me. I looked at the torn envelope. I asked where the letter was. He said he had thrown it out. He said reading it was upsetting, and he did not see the benefit of keeping a rejection letter in the house. I said I would like to read it anyway. He said he did not have it anymore. I looked at him for a moment. He was already moving toward the back, already done with the conversation in the way he was always done with conversations when they required him to stay in them longer than he had planned. The customers at the counter had not noticed anything unusual. The fluorescent strip above the cold case hummed. The lunch hour continued. I worked until 3. I drove home. I changed out of my work clothes and came down to the kitchen to make something to eat. And Patricia was at the stove, finishing the dinner prep, her back to me, and for a while, neither of us spoke. Then she said, without turning around, that she needed to tell me something. She said Dennis had not thrown the letter away. She said he had taken it to the kitchen sink and burned it. She said he had a matchbox from the drawer beside the stove, and he lit the corner and held it until it was gone, and then ran the tap over the ash. She said it the way she reported that the grocery store had been out of the brand of coffee Dennis preferred, a fact being transferred, the emotional temperature of the sentence held deliberately flat. She kept her eyes on the stove while she said it. I asked if she had tried to stop him. She did not answer. That was its own answer. I went to my room and closed the door and sat on the floor with my back against the bed. Not the mattress, the bed frame, the hard edge of it, which is how you sit when you want something solid and certain behind you. The room was quiet in the specific way that rooms are quiet when you have just understood something you cannot unknow. I did not cry. The feeling was not grief yet. It was more like standing in a doorway and finding out the room on the other side did not exist, that someone had built a wall where you believed there was a space and had been maintaining it for months without telling you. The yellow legal pad on my desk held 4 years of scheduled hours. The biochemistry textbooks on the shelf held 4 years of highlighted passages and margin notes. All of it had been aimed at a door that my father had decided, alone, in his back office, to close. I sat on that floor for a long time. Gerald Webb arrived at the deli the next morning at his usual time, somewhere between 10 and 10:15, with the Friday mail bundled under his arm. He dropped the stack on the counter beside the register and looked at me the way he occasionally looked at me, a brief, direct assessment, not intrusive, but not uninvested either. He asked how the Hartfield application was going. He remembered I had mentioned waiting for responses this week. I told him it was a rejection. I said it the way you say something that you have already rehearsed saying, without the edges that the information still had on the inside. He said he was sorry to hear it. He said it simply and did not reach for anything beyond that. He picked up his satchel and continued his route. But he paused at the door, just for a second. He looked back at me once, briefly, and then walked out. I did not notice it at the time. Later, I would understand that he was doing the thing he did on his route every day, reading what was in front of him and checking whether what he saw matched what he expected to see. He had put an envelope through that slot 3 weeks earlier. He remembered the return address. He remembered the weight of it, which was heavier than a standard letter, the way acceptances are always heavier than rejections because they contain more. He knew what those envelopes looked like from the outside. He had delivered 2 of them in 31 years on his route to families on his rounds, and he knew the size and the stock and the institutional seal in the upper corner. A rejection from a medical school arrives in a standard number 10 envelope, single sheet, 1 page. What he had put through that slot 3 weeks ago was not that. He did not say any of this to me. He walked out and finished his route and went home, and he sat with it. And the sitting with it was where everything that came later began. The first thing I did the Saturday after the letter was put the textbooks in a box. Not angrily, I want to be clear about that, because the anger came later in a form I did not recognize as anger for a long time. What I felt in those first days was something quieter and more disorienting, the specific numbness of someone who has been moving toward a fixed point for 4 years and has looked up to find the point is gone. I stacked the biochemistry textbooks, the organic chemistry volumes, the MCAT prep materials, the physiology notes bound with rubber bands, into a cardboard box from the Deli's supply room and pushed it to the back of my closet behind the winter coats. I did not throw them away. I was not ready for that kind of finality. I just needed them out of sight, because every morning I had been waking up and looking at that shelf and feeling the gap between where I had been and where I had ended up, and the gap was too wide to look at before 7 in the morning. Dennis noticed the shift in my schedule within a week. Not the box, not the books. He noticed that I was available. I stopped mentioning classes or study sessions or the lab hours that had occasionally conflicted with the Saturday prep shifts he wanted covered. My calendar cleared in the way that only happens when the thing filling it has been removed. And Dennis moved into that space the way he always moved into available space, with practicality and no acknowledgement of what had made it available. He told me I was doing good work. He said the morning prep was running better since I had taken it back on. He said not everyone was suited to the kind of extended schooling that medical programs required, that there was real skill in what I did at the counter, and that the deli was something worth building on. He said all of this without looking up from whatever he was doing, as if the observations were incidental, which meant they were not incidental at all. Tyler turned 21 in March. Dennis bought him a used Honda Civic, a dark gray four-door with 112,000 miles and a sound system that was better than anything else in the car. The gift was presented at dinner on a Sunday as a practical decision. Tyler needed reliable transportation. The bus schedule was inconvenient for where Tyler was thinking of working, and it made sense to invest in his mobility now. I sat at that table and watched my brother accept a car and thought about the 4 years I had driven myself to the testing center in my own vehicle, a 9-year-old Toyota I had bought with deli wages, and the MCAT scores that had come back in the 89th percentile, and the applications I had sent to 8 schools, and how none of that had produced a single conversation at a Sunday dinner that sounded anything like what I was hearing right now. I did not say this out loud. I passed the bread rolls and asked Tyler if he liked the color. Patricia continued in her orbit. She made dinner 4 nights a week, confirmed my Saturday hours each Friday evening as if they required mutual agreement rather than being simply a given, and occasionally asked how I was holding up in the careful, surface-level way that people ask questions they do not want answered in full. I told her I was fine. She said good. We both understood the contract. In April, I took a second job. The listing was on a hospital employment board I found through a community posting. Front desk receptionist at Mercy General Hospital on West 25th Street. Weekday morning shifts from 7 to noon. Benefits eligible after 60 days. I told myself I applied because the hours fit around the deli schedule, and the pay was $2 an hour above what I was making at the counter. Both of those things were true. What I did not say to myself, and what I understood only gradually over the weeks that followed, was that I had chosen a hospital over every other employer in the listings without spending a meaningful amount of time considering any of the others. The front desk at Mercy General placed me between the main entrance and the internal medicine wing. I checked patients in, confirmed insurance information, directed visitors to the correct floors, answered the main line. The work was competent and required attention and gave me nothing to think about beyond the immediate task, which was what I needed in those weeks. During my breaks, I sat in the staff waiting area off the main corridor and read whatever I could find. The waiting area had a rack of donated magazines and a small bookshelf with paperback novels and the occasional discarded textbook left by rotating residents. In the third week of April, I found a dog-eared MCAT prep book in a free box outside a used bookstore 2 blocks from the hospital on my walk to work. I carried it with me in my bag without examining my reasons for doing so. During breaks, I opened it to whatever section I had been on when I last closed it, and read until my time was up. Dr. Karen Ellison passed the front desk twice each day. She was the chief of the internal medicine department, a woman in her mid-50s with close-cropped gray hair and the kind of unhurried movement that people develop when they have been working in hospitals long enough to understand the difference between urgency and panic. She had a specific way of moving through the main corridor, direct and consistent, that told you she knew exactly where she was going before she left wherever she had been. She noticed me during the first week, not with any visible interest, just the brief professional awareness of someone cataloging the faces in a space they move through regularly. By the third week, she was nodding at the desk when she passed. On a Thursday in late April, she stopped. She looked at the book on the desk in front of me. I had set it to the side of the check-in materials, open to the biological sciences section, the cover worn enough that the title was barely legible. She asked what I was reading. I said it was nothing, just something I had found. She looked at the book for another moment and then at me and said it did not look like nothing. Then she walked away. I watched her go and then looked back at the book. I had been telling myself for 6 weeks that I was done with this direction, that the rejection was information and I had processed it and moved forward, that the book in my bag was a habit rather than a continuation. Dr. Ellison had looked at it for approximately 4 seconds and said 3 words. And something in my chest shifted slightly, the way a window shifts when the latch gives even before it opens. She came back the following Thursday. She stopped at the desk again, same time, same direction, and asked if I had gotten any further with the reading. I said a few chapters. She asked which section. I told her the biochemistry passages. She nodded once and said those were the sections most candidates underestimated, and that the time spent on them was worth it. Then she walked on. She had not asked why I was reading an MCAT prep book at a hospital reception desk after presenting herself as a physician who led a department. She had simply engaged with the information I had in front of me as if it were the most natural thing in the world. I thought about that exchange for the rest of the shift. Gerald Webb, meanwhile, had been carrying something of his own. Every morning on his route, he passed the Deli window around 10. And every morning for 6 weeks, he glanced through the glass at the counter where I worked. And every morning, the surface in front of me was bare. No textbook propped against the register, no legal pad with its scheduled hour blocks, no Anki deck open on my phone between customers. Just the counter, the register, and my hands doing the work they had always done. He had been delivering mail on Prospect Avenue for 19 years and had watched me study at that counter for 4 of them, and the absence of the books registered with him the way a missing piece registers with someone who has memorized a pattern. He did not bring it up again after that first Friday morning. He dropped the mail, said good morning, moved on. But the information he was sitting with had not gone anywhere. He knew what he had put through that slot in February. He knew the size of the envelope and the seal on the upper left corner, and the specific quality of the paper stock that institutions used for formal admissions correspondence. He had been in this job long enough to know that a rejection from a university arrived in a standard business envelope, 1 page, sometimes less. What he had delivered that morning was not that. It had the weight and the dimensions of something else entirely. He was not a man who reached conclusions quickly. He sat with things. He turned them over carefully and examined them from more than one angle before he decided what they meant. But 6 weeks after that Friday morning conversation, driving home from his route on a warm April afternoon with the windows down, he made a decision about what he was going to do next. And the decision did not involve waiting any longer to do it. General Webb had been a USPS carrier for 31 years, and in those 31 years, he had developed a relationship with the mail that most people would not recognize as a skill because it did not look like one from the outside. It looked like a man walking a route. What it actually was the accumulation of 31 years of handling correspondence in every form, every weight, every institutional format that American bureaucracy produced, until the physical characteristics of a piece of mail communicated information the way a face communicates information to someone who has spent decades reading faces. He knew the difference between a utility bill and a credit offer before he read the return address, from the weight and the stock. He knew when a piece of certified mail had been sitting in a box for too long and the signature was going to be a problem. He knew which houses on his route had elderly residents who needed the mail placed directly in hand rather than in a slot. He knew what correspondence from a state government office felt like versus correspondence from a federal one. These were not things he had been taught. They were things that accumulated over 3 decades, the way any deep knowledge accumulates, through repetition and attention, and a quiet investment in doing the work correctly. He knew what a medical school rejection letter looked like. Standard business envelope, number 10, white or ivory, the institution's return address in the upper left corner, printed rather than embossed. 1 sheet inside, sometimes 2, but rarely more. Light, the kind of letter that delivers information efficiently because there is not much to say. He had delivered them over the years, to houses on various routes, and he had felt the weight of them in his hands, and known before the recipients opened them that the news was not what they had hoped for. Not because he read other people's mail, because he had been doing this long enough that the physical object told him things the addressee would only learn when they opened it. What he had put through the mail slot at Hollis Deli on Prospect Avenue in late February had not felt like that. It had been a 9x12 envelope, the kind that institutions used when they needed the contents to lie flat, when there were multiple pages involved, when the correspondence was formal enough to warrant a presentation that a folded sheet inside a standard envelope could not provide. The return address was Hartfield University School of Medicine, Office of Admissions, Columbus, Ohio. The weight of it was the weight of several pages, perhaps an information packet, perhaps a contract, perhaps a welcome letter accompanied by enrollment materials. General had noted all of this in the second or two it took him to slide it through the slot, the way he noted everything on his route, without stopping, without dwelling, but with the part of his attention that never fully shut off. When Elizabeth told him she had received a rejection, he had nodded and said he was sorry and moved on. He had done this because she had said it in the tone of someone who had already processed the information and did not need it examined, and he was not the kind of man who pushed. But the disconnect between what he had delivered and what she had described sat with him the way a small wrong note sits in a piece of music, not disruptive enough to interrupt the whole, but present in a way that does not resolve. He had a daughter named Cassie who was 26 years old and lived in Akron. Cassie had enrolled in a licensed practical nursing program at a community college 4 years earlier and stopped midway through the second semester. General knew the reason, which was that Cassie's then-boyfriend had told her the hours would be incompatible with the life he wanted them to build, and Cassie had believed him, and by the time she stopped believing him, she felt too far behind to go back. Gerald had not been able to do anything about it. He had watched it happen and had not found the action that would have changed the outcome. And that specific helplessness had settled somewhere in him where it had been sitting ever since. He was not a man who talked about such things, but he thought about them, particularly on routes that took him past the deli window where he had watched Elizabeth study at the counter for 4 years with the focused patience of someone who understood that what she was building required every hour she could give it. He made the phone call on a Wednesday evening in mid-April, 6 weeks after Elizabeth had told him about the rejection. He had looked up the Hartfield admissions office number on the university website from his kitchen table on the laptop his wife had convinced him to learn to use 3 years earlier. He dialed it and waited through 2 rings. A woman answered and identified herself as the Office of Admissions. Gerald told her his name and his USPS employee number and said he was calling as a carrier on a route that included an address associated with one of the university's applicants. He said he was flagging a potential delivery concern and wanted to verify that a piece of correspondence had reached its intended recipient. He gave Elizabeth's full name. He gave the Prospect Avenue address. The woman asked him to hold. He sat at his kitchen table with the phone against his ear and listened to the hold music, which was a generic instrumental arrangement, and looked at the window above the sink where his wife kept a small clay pot of herbs she replaced every spring. The hold lasted approximately 90 seconds. The woman came back and identified herself more fully as Linda Reeves, admissions coordinator, 14 years in the office. She said she had pulled up the file for Elizabeth Hollis. She paused, and in that pause, Gerald heard something shift in her professional tone, a slight recalibration. She said that Elizabeth Hollis had been accepted into the current incoming class and that as of the date of this call, the office had not received any response to the acceptance offer. The deadline to respond had passed 11 days earlier with no communication from the applicant. Gerald sat with that for a moment. Then he said he understood and asked whether the office had a process for sending a duplicate of the acceptance notification to an alternate address in circumstances where a delivery concern had been flagged. Linda said that under normal circumstances, that kind of request required authorization from the applicant herself, and that sending correspondence to an address the applicant had not provided would fall outside standard protocol. Gerald said he understood. He thanked her for her time. He said he might be in touch again. He ended the call and set the phone on the table and sat there. His wife came into the kitchen 20 minutes later and asked if he wanted coffee. He said yes. She poured 2 cups and sat across from him and did not ask what he was thinking about, because after 33 years of marriage, she had learned to recognize the difference between the thinking that wanted company and the thinking that needed space. She gave him space. He sat with the coffee and the information and the specific knowledge that a young woman who had studied organic chemistry at a deli counter between sandwich orders for 4 years had been accepted to medical school and had no idea. He thought about it for 2 days. He turned the problem from every angle he could find. Linda Reeves had been clear. A duplicate required the applicant's authorization. He could tell Elizabeth what he knew. He could ask her to call the admissions office herself. That was the straightforward path, and it was available to him, and he considered it seriously. But he also considered what he knew about the situation, which was that the original letter had arrived at the deli and had not reached Elizabeth, and that the deli was where Dennis Hollis spent his days, and that Dennis Hollis was the one who had come to the counter with a torn, empty envelope and delivered the word rejection in a flat, practiced voice. If Gerald called Elizabeth and told her what Linda Reeves had said, he was asking her to walk back into that house and have a conversation with the man who had burned the letter, with no documentation, no evidence, nothing except the word of a postal worker against the word of her father. That was not a fight she could win from where she was standing. On the second day, Gerald looked up the driving distance from Cleveland to Columbus, 41 miles, roughly 50 minutes depending on traffic on I-71 southbound. He was off on Thursdays. He folded the laptop closed and went to tell his wife he would need the car on Thursday. Gerald left his house at 7:45 on a Thursday morning in late April with his USPS employee identification card in his shirt pocket and 3 sheets of paper folded in the inside pocket of his jacket. He had written the statement the night before at the kitchen table while his wife watched television in the other room. He had written it the way he did everything, carefully, without extra language, stating only what he knew and what he had observed and what he was requesting, and leaving out everything he could not directly confirm. He was not accusing anyone of anything. He was documenting a discrepancy between what he had delivered and what he had been told the recipient received. He drove south on I-71 with the windows down a few inches, the way he preferred in the mornings. The drive from the west side of Cleveland to Columbus took 53 minutes in light traffic. He had allowed himself 2 hours each direction and a meeting in between. He had not made an appointment at the admissions office because he had not been certain, when he decided to make the trip, that announcing himself in advance was the right approach. He had decided instead to arrive, identify himself, and ask for whoever handled delivery irregularities or applicant correspondence concerns. If they turned him away, he would know he had tried. He did not believe they would turn him away. The Hartfield University campus sat on the eastern edge of Columbus, a cluster of brick and limestone buildings arranged around a central quad that was still green from the spring rains. Gerald parked in a visitor lot near the main entrance and followed the campus map on the information board to the admissions building, a 2-story structure with glass doors and a lobby that smelled of institutional carpet and the specific neutral air of an office that processed important decisions for a living. A student worker at the reception desk directed him to the second floor. The Office of Admissions occupied the front half of the second floor, its waiting area furnished with upholstered chairs and a low table with brochures fanned out in a careful arrangement. General sat in one of the chairs for 4 minutes before a woman in her early 50s came through the interior door and introduced herself as Linda Reeves. She was the person he had spoken to on the phone 2 days before. She had a composed, professional manner and the kind of careful attention in her eyes that told him she had already thought about this meeting before he arrived. She led him into a small conference room with a table and 4 chairs and a window that faced the central quad. He sat across from her and placed his identification card on the table and took the 3 sheets of paper from his jacket pocket and set them beside it. He told her he had written an account of his observations and his concern, and that he wanted to share it directly rather than send it through general correspondence because he thought the matter warranted a personal conversation. She read the statement without speaking. It took her approximately 4 minutes to read 3 pages, which told Gerald she was reading carefully rather than skimming. When she finished, she set the papers down and looked at him and said she wanted to bring in her supervisor, the Associate Director of Admissions, before continuing. Gerald said that was fine. Craig Foley arrived 7 minutes later. He was in his mid-40s, with the measured bearing of someone who spent his days making decisions that affected other people's futures and understood the weight of that. Linda handed him the statement. He read it, standing beside the table, which Gerald noticed because it suggested he intended to read it once and act on it, rather than sit with it for an extended period. When he finished, he set the papers down and looked at Gerald and asked 2 questions. The first was whether Gerald had any reason to believe anyone at the address had deliberately intercepted the correspondence. General said he could not confirm that and was not making that claim. He said he was documenting what he had delivered, what he had been told, and the discrepancy between the 2, and leaving the interpretation to the people whose job it was to interpret. The second question was whether Gerald had spoken to the applicant about his concern. Gerald said he had not. He said he did not think that was the right order of operations. Craig looked at Linda for a moment. Then he said that under normal circumstances, the office did not send acceptance notifications to addresses the applicant had not provided. Gerald said he understood. He said he was not asking the office to take his word for anything or to deviate from its protocols. He was asking whether there was a process for follow-up contact with an applicant who had not responded to an acceptance offer and whose listed employment address might be distinct from her home address. He said this because he knew from the phone call 2 days earlier that Elizabeth had listed her employment at Mercy General Hospital on her application. The hospital was on the Postal system's standard commercial route. It was not the Prospect Avenue address. Craig was quiet for a moment. Then he said the office did have a standard follow-up process for non-responding accepted applicants, and that sending a follow-up to a listed alternate contact address was within that process. He said if the listed employment address was active and verifiable, the office could send the follow-up notification there. He said it carefully, the way institutional people say things when they are working within their authority rather than outside it. Gerald said that would be sufficient. He thanked them both, collected his identification card, and left the 3 sheets of paper on the table. He drove back to Cleveland and was home before noon. The follow-up letter went out from the Hartfield admissions office 3 days later, addressed to Elizabeth Hollis in care of Mercy General Hospital's administrative office on West 25th Street. Gerald had, the morning after the Columbus trip, requested a route adjustment from his supervisor at the Cleveland Distribution Center, citing a scheduling gap on a commercial route that included a stretch of West 25th Street. Route adjustments were common enough that the request required no particular explanation. His supervisor processed it in an afternoon. Gerald's expanded route now included the Mercy General mail. The Hartfield envelope arrived in his sorted bundle on a Tuesday morning, 8 days after his drive to Columbus. He knew it by sight before he touched it. The 9x12 format, the Hartfield return address, the weight of it. He sorted the morning mail at the distribution center, and when he reached the Mercy General bundle, he removed the envelope and did not include it in the institutional stack that would go into the hospital's administrative mailbox. He placed it in the inside pocket of his jacket. He finished his route in the order it was scheduled, the deli being near the end of his Prospect Avenue stretch, and he arrived at Hollis Deli at approximately 10:14 in the morning. He parked his mail vehicle at the curb. He walked to the front door with the institutional mail in his left hand and the envelope from Hartfield inside his jacket against his chest. He pushed the door open and stepped into the deli. The morning regulars were at the counter. The fluorescent strip hummed above the cold case. Elizabeth was at the register, her back partially turned as she restocked the napkin holder beside the condiment station. Dennis, as far as Gerald could tell, was in the back. General walked to the counter and set the institutional mail on the surface beside the register. Then he reached into his jacket and took out the Hartfield envelope and placed it on the counter directly in front of Elizabeth and said, "This is addressed to you. I wanted to make certain you received it personally." She turned and looked at it. What happened in that deli in the next 4 minutes was the thing I have spent 7 years trying to find the right words for. And I was the one standing on the other side of the counter when it happened. So let me tell you exactly what those 4 minutes looked like from where I was standing. I looked at the envelope on the counter for a moment before I touched it. Not because I was uncertain about picking it up, but because I was buying myself the 1 or 2 seconds I needed to make sure my hands were steady before I did. The return address was in the upper left corner, printed in the clean, institutional font I had memorized from 8 months of waiting. Hartfield University School of Medicine, Office of Admissions, Columbus, Ohio. The envelope was a 9x12 format. It was thicker than a single page. I picked it up. Gerald had stepped back from the counter slightly, giving me room. He was not watching me the way people watch when they want to see a reaction. He was watching the way a person watches when they have done everything they could do, and the outcome is now out of their hands. I opened the envelope at the sealed end. There were 2 pages inside on Hartfield letterhead, the university seal embossed at the top of the first page. The date on the letter was 8 days earlier. I read the first paragraph. It said, "Dear Ms. Hollis, this communication serves as a formal follow-up to our offer of admission to the Hartfield University School of Medicine. As of the date of this letter, your enrollment response remains outstanding. We are writing to confirm your continued interest and to inform you that a brief extension may be available given the circumstances that may have prevented your timely response. Please contact our office at your earliest convenience to discuss your options." I read it a second time. Our offer of admission, not a rejection follow-up, not a waitlist notification. An offer of admission that had been sitting on record at the Hartfield admissions office for 11 weeks while I had been working the deli counter under the understanding that the answer had been no. I set the letter on the counter in front of me, face up. I set it down carefully, the way you set down something you want to remain exactly where you put it. The first paragraph was fully visible to anyone standing at the register. The words "offer of admission" were in plain text in the second line. The deli had gone quiet, in the particular way it goes quiet when people in a shared space sense that something is happening that exceeds the ordinary. The 3 regulars at the far end of the counter had stopped their conversation. The man in the middle, who had been working through a crossword, had his pen resting on the paper. No one had left. No one was pretending not to notice. Dennis came through the back doorway at that moment. He came out the way he always came out when something in the front of the house required his attention, with purpose, wiping his hands on the dish towel he kept tucked at his waist. He looked at me first. Then his eyes went to the envelope on the counter, and then to the letter lying face up beside it. He read far enough to understand what he was reading. I know this because his hands stopped moving. The dish towel went still in both fists. He looked at Gerald. Gerald looked back at him and did not say anything. Dennis started to speak. He said the word look, which is the word people use when they need a moment to build a sentence they have not prepared. Then he said he had done what he did because the deli was the family's livelihood, that medical school was expensive and far away and not a guaranteed outcome, that the deli was real and stable, and he had needed someone he could count on to keep it running. He said he had made a judgment about what was best for the family. He said all of this in the practical, settled tone he used when he was presenting a decision as concluded rather than as a subject for discussion. When he finished, I said, "You told me it was a rejection." I said it the way I had said things to him my entire life, without heat, without volume. I had learned a long time ago that heat gave him something to push against, and volume gave him permission to dismiss the conversation as emotional. I said it the way you state a coordinate on a map. This is where we are. This is the fact. He said she had to understand. He said the deli had needed stability. He said Tyler was not ready, and Patricia was part-time, and Elizabeth had always been the one who knew how it worked, who actually cared about the place. He said it like this was an argument that had a second side. I said, "You burned it." 2 words, quieter than the first sentence. The man with the crossword at the end of the counter set his pen down fully. The regulars did not look away. Gerald stood 4 feet from the counter and did not move. Dennis looked at me, and then at the letter, and then at the room, taking in the faces of the people who had been sitting at his counter for years, people who knew him by name, people who had watched his daughter work the register since she was 14 years old. And he found, in that specific and honest accounting, that there was nothing left to say. Not because the argument was unavailable to him, because the argument required a version of reality that the letter on the counter had made impossible to maintain. His hands were still. Patricia arrived at 10:47. Dennis had sent her a text from the back office at some point during the preceding minutes. I did not know this at the time, but learned it later. She walked through the front door of the deli in her dental office clothes, a light blue blouse and dark slacks, her car keys still in her hand, and she stepped into the room and read it the way she read every room she entered, quickly and from the surface inward. She saw the letter on the counter. She saw Dennis standing 3 feet behind it with the dish towel still in his fists. She saw Gerald by the door. She saw my face. She walked to the nearest table and sat down in a chair facing the window and set her keys on the table in front of her and did not say anything for a long time. I looked at her. She met my eyes and held them. And in that exchange, I understood something I had been turning over for 2 months without being able to resolve it. She had known. She had known the night she told me he burned it in the kitchen sink, told me in the tone of someone reporting a minor inconvenience, and she had not done anything to stop it. And she had carried that knowledge through every dinner and every Saturday shift confirmation and every once a semester "how are things" conversation since February. She had sat with it and let it be. That was its own kind of decision, and it lived in the room with us now, along with everything else. I picked up the letter and folded it carefully along the original crease and put it back in the envelope. I set the envelope in the inside pocket of my apron. I looked at Dennis and said I needed to make a phone call, and I was going to step outside. He said her name. I walked past the counter, past Gerald, past the regulars who had not moved, and through the front door into the parking lot. The morning air was cool and bright. I stood beside my car and took the envelope out of my apron and opened it again and looked at the phone number printed at the bottom of the letter page. The Hartfield Admissions Office. My response was outstanding. An extension might be available. I did not know how much time I had. I did not know whether the extension was 3 days or 3 weeks, or whether it had already closed before the letter even reached me. I did not know yet whether there was any path back into the future that had been taken from me 11 weeks ago. I knew only that the path had existed, that the door had been open and I had not known it, and that the only way to find out whether it was still open was to call the number in my hand right now before another minute passed. I dialed. Gerald Webb was still inside the deli when I made that call. He had not left. He stood at the counter with his postal satchel over one shoulder, and when Dennis finally moved toward the back office without speaking, Gerald picked up the institutional mail stack he had left on the counter at the start of the morning, the one that was not the letter in my apron, and finished his delivery. He had done what he came to do. The rest of it was mine to carry. Linda Reeves picked up on the second ring. I was standing in the parking lot beside my car with the Hartfield letter in my hand and the morning sun coming in at a low angle across the asphalt. Gerald's mail vehicle was still at the curb. He had come out of the deli behind me and was standing near the driver's side door, not close enough to hear the call, but present in the way that told me he was not leaving until he knew the conversation had happened. I registered this without looking directly at him, and then turned my attention to the phone. I told Linda my name. I told her I was calling about an offer of admission to the current or recent incoming class. I said I had received the follow-up letter that morning at an address listed on my application, and that I was calling because the circumstances surrounding my failure to respond to the original offer were not what they appeared to be from the admissions office's perspective. I said the original acceptance notification had been delivered to my family's home address and had not reached me. I said I had only learned of the acceptance this morning. I kept my voice at the same register I used at the hospital reception desk, clear and without unnecessary weight, because I needed her to hear the information rather than the feeling. She said she remembered my name from the carrier's inquiry and the follow-up process. She said she was glad I had called. She asked me to describe the circumstances briefly and then asked me to follow up with a written account submitted to the office email address by end of business that day. She said she would bring the matter to Craig Foley and request that it be reviewed by the admissions committee at the earliest opportunity. She said she could not promise a specific outcome, and she said this without softening it, which I respected. She was telling me the truth about what she could and could not control, and that was what I needed to hear. I wrote the account at the deli counter after the morning regulars cleared out. Dennis had gone to the back office and stayed there. The register was mine, and the counter was quiet, and I opened the notes application on my phone and wrote 4 paragraphs, factual, chronological, beginning with the date the letter had been delivered to the Prospect Avenue address and ending with the morning I received the follow-up notification. I did not use charged language. I described what happened in order and sent it to the admissions office email address from my personal account at 11:42. Then I called Dr. Karen Ellison. She answered her hospital extension on the 3rd ring. I said her name and identified myself and said I had something I needed to ask her. I told her what had happened with the Hartfield letter and the admissions committee process, and that I was putting together documentation to support my account, and that I was calling to ask whether she would be willing to write a letter of support. I said I understood if the timeline was difficult and that I could give her as much detail as she needed. She was quiet for a moment. Not a long moment, the kind of pause that belongs to someone who has already made their decision and is simply giving the question its proper acknowledgement before responding. Then she said she would have a letter to the admissions office before she left the building that evening. She said she'd been waiting for me to ask for something. She said it without drama, the way she said most things, as a plain statement of what was true. I said thank you. She said she would see me at the desk tomorrow morning. Gerald submitted his written account the same day. I did not ask him to. He had already prepared it, the same account he had brought to Columbus 2 weeks earlier, and he sent a signed copy to the Hartfield admissions office with a cover note stating his USPS employee number and the specific details of the February delivery. He did not tell me he had done this until later. I found out when Linda Reeves mentioned, during a follow-up call, that the committee file included a statement from the carrier. The committee meeting was scheduled for 3 days after my initial call. I knew this because Linda sent a brief email confirmation telling me the matter had been referred to the committee and that I would receive communication of the decision within 5 business days of the meeting. That was all the information I had. 5 days was a window wide enough to contain any number of outcomes, and I had no way of narrowing it from the outside. Those 3 days had a specific texture that is difficult to describe to someone who has not waited for an institutional decision that could redirect the entire shape of their life. I went to work. I checked patients in at the Mercy General reception desk and answered the phones and directed visitors to the correct floors. I worked my deli shifts without speaking to Dennis beyond the minimum the work required. I ate meals. I slept approximately 5 hours each night. I did not tell Tyler. I did not discuss it with Patricia beyond a brief exchange in which I told her the committee was meeting, and she nodded and looked at the table. I ran the hospital's MCAT prep book through the corresponding chapters each evening on my couch, not to prepare for anything specific, but because the familiar structure of the material steadied me. The studying had always steadied me. On the evening of the second day, my phone rang at 8:43. It was Patricia. She said she had something to tell me. She said that the morning in February, when Dennis had taken the envelope to the back office, she had been in the kitchen when he carried it through. She had not known what the envelope contained at that point, only that he was separating it from the rest of the mail. Later that evening, after he had burned it, she had gone back to the recycling bin in the kitchen and found the torn envelope he had discarded. Just the envelope. Nothing inside. She had taken it and put it in the pocket of her winter coat without a clear understanding of why, and it had stayed there through the rest of the winter and into spring, and she still had it. I said I needed it. She said she knew. She said she would mail it to me tomorrow morning. I gave her my hospital mailing address, the same one on the Hartfield letter, and she wrote it down and read it back to me to confirm. Then she said she was sorry. She did not specify what she was sorry for, which was honest because the list was not short and she knew it as well as I did. I said I heard her. The call ended. The torn envelope arrived at the hospital administrative office 2 days later, and I hand-delivered it to Linda Reeves at the Hartfield admissions office by overnight mail with a brief cover note explaining what it was and who had preserved it and how it had been stored since February. It was the physical evidence that a 9x12 admissions envelope had arrived at the Prospect Avenue address, been opened by someone other than me, and discarded. It did not prove what had happened to the letter inside, but it confirmed that the envelope had existed, that it had been the right size and format for an acceptance notification, and that it had arrived at a time consistent with Hartfield's February mailing schedule. The committee met on a Thursday. I received Linda's email on the following Monday at 9:07 in the morning, while I was at the hospital reception desk before my shift technically began. The email was 4 sentences. The committee had reviewed the full file, including Gerald's carrier account, Dr. Ellison's letter of support, my written account, and the physical envelope. Given the documented irregularity in the delivery of the original acceptance notification, the committee had voted to defer my acceptance to the incoming class beginning the following September. The enrollment deposit and reapplication fee were both waived. She included a link to the enrollment materials and asked me to confirm receipt. I read the email twice. Then I put my phone in my pocket and sat at the reception desk and looked at the corridor where Dr. Ellison would appear in approximately 40 minutes on her first pass of the morning. The corridor was empty, and the hospital was doing what hospitals do at 7 in the morning, quietly preparing for what the day would bring. Dennis, I learned later, had contacted a family attorney in the days following the Deli confrontation. The attorney had explained to him, in terms that required no interpretation, that willful destruction of USPS mail was a federal criminal offense under United States Code Title 18, Section 1705, and carried penalties up to 5 years imprisonment for each count. He had further explained that Gerald Webb's formal account, submitted to a university admissions office and copied to the USPS regional office, constituted a documented complaint that created a paper trail Dennis could not make disappear. The attorney had advised Dennis in the clearest possible terms not to contact Hartfield University, not to contact Gerald Webb, not to take any action that could be characterized as interference with an ongoing institutional review process, and to say nothing publicly about any aspect of the matter. Dennis said nothing. He did not call the admissions office. He did not attempt to follow up with me about the committee's decision. He went to work at the Deli each morning and came home each evening, and the subject did not come up again in my presence. I gave notice at the Deli that Wednesday. I kept the hospital job through the summer. In September, I loaded my car with 4 boxes and a duffel bag and drove 41 miles south on I-71 to Columbus, Ohio, and moved into a graduate student apartment 2 blocks from the Hartfield campus. I had reserved a spot in the incoming class. I had a letter of enrollment in a folder on the front seat beside me. The framed follow-up letter was wrapped in a dish towel at the top of the first box. The drive took 54 minutes in light morning traffic. I arrived before noon. I parked and carried the boxes upstairs and put the framed letter on the desk and stood in the center of a room that was entirely mine, and thought about a yellow legal pad with 1-hour blocks and the particular hum of a fluorescent strip above a Deli cold case, and the way 4 years of work looks from the outside versus from the inside. And I understood for the first time that there was no version of the past 7 months I would have changed, because every piece of it had brought me to the only place I had ever actually been heading. I had a class at 8 the following morning. Medical school begins before you are ready for it and does not pause while you catch up. This is not a complaint. It is simply the nature of the thing. And the nature of the thing was exactly what I had been preparing for across 4 years of pre-med coursework and 18 months of MCAT preparation, and every hour I had spent studying at a deli counter between orders. When the first week of classes arrived, I had been waiting for it for so long that the experience of sitting in an actual Hartfield lecture hall with an actual course syllabus open on my desk and actual medical students on either side of me had the quality of a room I had imagined so specifically for so long that walking into it in person felt less like arrival and more like recognition. I kept the framed letter on my desk throughout all 4 years, both pages, under glass, positioned so that the first paragraph faced outward from the wall. Not as a reminder of what had happened, as a reminder of what the work was for. The first anatomy lab was on a Monday morning in the 3rd week of October. The room was in the basement of the Hartfield Sciences Building, and it had the particular quality of air that anatomy rooms have, cool and sealed, and carrying a faint undertone that you register before you identify it, formaldehyde, and the specific antiseptic overlay that institutions use to manage what they cannot eliminate. 12 tables, 12 cadavers draped in white, lab partners assigned alphabetically, which placed me beside a woman named Rachel Holbrook, who would become one of the 2 people in my class I trusted without reservation. The instructor said we would begin with the upper limb, and the room went quiet in the way it goes quiet when a group of people who have all prepared for a moment are standing at the threshold of it and discovering that preparation and arrival are 2 distinct experiences. I made the first incision at 9:14 in the morning. My hands were steady. I had expected them to be steady because steadiness under pressure was a skill I had been developing since I was 14 years old behind a deli register, and the mechanisms were the same even if the stakes were categorically different. What I had not expected was the quality of focus that descended once the work began, a specific narrowing of attention that eliminated everything outside the task and left only the task itself, clear and present and requiring everything I had. I understood in that hour that this was not just something I was capable of doing. It was the kind of work I was built for. The second year brought the first clinical rotations and the first understanding of what medicine felt like from inside a patient encounter rather than inside a textbook. I was on a hospitalist rotation in November when a 47-year-old man was admitted through the emergency department with what had been assessed as a severe anxiety episode. The attending on my team reviewed the case at the morning briefing, and something in the symptom profile did not resolve cleanly against the anxiety diagnosis for me. I spent 3 hours that evening reading cardiac literature and brought my concern to the resident the following morning. The resident ordered additional cardiac imaging. The man had a cardiac arrhythmia that the initial workup had missed. The attending told me after rounds that the note I had flagged had been the right call. I thought about that case for 3 days, not with pride, with the quiet understanding that the distance between a missed diagnosis and a caught one was exactly the kind of distance I was here to close. The third year was the hardest. The clinical hours were long, the learning curve was continuous, and the accumulation of knowledge and responsibility arrived simultaneously without waiting for either to stabilize before adding the other. There was a night in February when I stayed in the Hartfield Hospital study room until 4 a.m, working through a complex case presentation I had been assigned for the next morning's attending conference. The study room at that hour was empty, and the hospital, beyond its walls, was operating in its overnight register. Quieter than day, but never still. The specific, inhabited quiet of a building that never fully stops. I finished the case write-up at 3:51 and leaned back in the chair and looked at the ceiling and felt a tiredness that went all the way to the center of things, and underneath it, something else. Something that had been there since that first anatomy lab, but had been too new to name. A kind of settled rightness. The recognition that I was exactly where I was supposed to be, and the work I was doing was the work I had always been heading toward. Not because it was easy, because it was mine. Dr. Karen Ellison drove to Columbus twice during those 4 years. Both times she called ahead and asked if I was free for dinner on a specific evening, and both times I arranged my schedule around her answer. She chose a small Italian restaurant on High Street that she seemed to know from previous visits. She ordered the linguine with clams both times and ate it with the unhurried attention she brought to everything. She asked about the rotations, the instructors, the cases I found most challenging. She did not offer opinions on my choices unless I asked for them, and when I did ask, she gave me precise, direct answers without wrapping them in encouragement. She was not building my confidence. She was engaging with my thinking, which was more useful than encouragement, and she understood that. Gerald Webb sent a card every year on the Tuesday in October closest to the anniversary of the Deli morning. The cards arrived at my student apartment address, which I had sent to him on a note card after I moved in. Each card had a brief printed message on the front that he had chosen deliberately. Nothing generic, always something about persistence or purpose. And on the inside, in his careful block handwriting, a single line, "Still rooting for you." He signed them Gerald Webb, USPS, retired, after the first year, because he had retired the previous spring, and the title had become a small private joke between us that had never been spoken aloud. I kept each card in the folder in my desk, where I stored the things that mattered. The white coat ceremony was in October of my first year, a Friday afternoon in the Hartfield Auditorium, with the incoming class and their guests arranged in a room that smelled of fresh flowers and the specific anticipation of a room full of people about to participate in something they will remember. I had reserved 2 seats in the second row for guests I wanted present. One seat was for Rachel Holbrook's mother, who had driven from Cincinnati and needed somewhere to sit near the front. The other seat was for Patricia. She arrived 20 minutes before the ceremony in a dress I had not seen before, a pale blue wool dress that still had the careful, pressed quality of something recently purchased. She had driven herself from Cleveland in her own car 2.5 hours, and when I met her in the lobby, she hugged me briefly and said nothing, which was the right response, and she knew it. She sat in the second row and held her program in her lap and watched the ceremony with an expression I could not fully read from the stage, something between composure and the effort required to maintain composure. When my name was called and I walked to the front and the department chair placed the white coat on my shoulders, I looked out at the second row and saw her press her hand briefly to her mouth and look at the ceiling for a moment before looking back. Dennis was not invited. He did not reach out to ask whether he was. I had made the decision about the ceremony guest list the same way I had made every decision in the previous year, by thinking carefully about what I needed and what I could sustain, and then acting accordingly. He was not on the list because his presence was not something I was in a position to manage on a day I had been working toward for 9 years. I heard from a family friend midway through my second year that Tyler had taken over the deli. Dennis had stepped back from day-to-day operations, citing his health, and Tyler was running the morning prep and the counter. The same family friend mentioned, in the careful phrasing people use when they are relaying information they believe is relevant without characterizing it, that the deli had been having some difficulty with the lunch business. I noted this information and did not pursue it further. I was studying cardiovascular pathophysiology that week and had an exam on Friday. Match day at Hartfield happened on a Thursday in March of my 4th year. The results for the National Resident Matching Program arrived in a coordinated email release at noon to the entire graduating class simultaneously, which meant that at 11:59, the hallways of the Hartfield building were crowded with 4th-year students holding phones and not speaking much. I was standing in the corridor outside the lecture hall, where I had spent more hours than I could accurately count, in my coat and my bag, and the specific stillness that arrives just before an outcome you cannot control resolves itself. At noon, my phone showed the email notification. I opened it. The subject line read, "Congratulations, you have matched." The body of the email named my first choice program, Emergency Medicine Residency, Allegheny General Hospital, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Start date, the last Monday of June. I stood in that corridor for approximately 30 seconds doing nothing but reading the email. Then I raised my phone and photographed the screen. I sent the photograph to 3 people, Gerald Webb, Dr. Karen Ellison, and Patricia Hollis. I added no caption. The image was sufficient. Then I put the phone in my coat pocket and walked to the lecture hall for my 11 o'clock class, which had already begun. I am 29 years old. I am a second-year emergency medicine resident at Allegheny General Hospital in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. I start most shifts at 6 in the morning and finish when the cases are finished, which is not always when the schedule says they will be finished, because the emergency department operates on the logic of what arrives rather than the logic of what was planned. I have learned to find a particular steadiness in that unpredictability. It is not unlike the steadiness I developed standing behind a deli register for 8 years, except that now the work on the other side of my attention is the kind that was always supposed to be there. My apartment is on the 3rd floor of a building 4 blocks from the hospital. It is a 1-bedroom with tall windows and a kitchen that gets morning light from the east. And on the windowsill above the sink, I keep 1 potted plant, a small succulent that my residency co-resident Rachel Holbrook gave me when I moved in, telling me it was the only plant she trusted me not to kill given my schedule. She was right about the schedule and wrong about the plant, which has been thriving for 14 months. Above my desk, framed under glass, are 2 items placed side by side. On the left is my Hartfield University School of Medicine diploma. On the right is the 2-page follow-up letter from the Hartfield admissions office, the one Gerald Webb placed on the counter at Hollis Deli on Prospect Avenue on a Tuesday morning in October 7 years ago. Both pages face outward. The first paragraph of the letter is still the first thing I see when I sit down to chart. In the top drawer of that desk, in a manila folder behind the other documents I keep in order, is a torn 9x12 envelope with the Hartfield return address in the upper left corner and no contents. Patricia mailed it to me 11 weeks after the deli morning, and it arrived at the Mercy General Administrative Office, and I carried it to Columbus and submitted it to the admissions committee, and it did what it needed to do. It has been in that drawer ever since. I do not take it out often. But I know it is there, and knowing it is there is enough. Dennis sent a letter in the spring of the year I started at Hartfield, 8 months after the admissions committee meeting. It was a standard letter-sized envelope, which I noticed before I opened it, and inside were 4 handwritten sentences. He said he had made a mistake. He said he was sorry. He said he hoped I was doing well in school. He said the deli had been going through some difficulty and that he hoped at some point we could talk. The handwriting was his, careful and slightly cramped. the handwriting of a man who did not write personal letters often and was applying more deliberateness to the task than came naturally. I read it once and put it in the folder in my desk drawer. I did not respond for 3 months. I used those months the way I had always used time when a decision mattered, carefully and without rushing, turning the question from different angles until I understood what I was actually being asked and what I was actually willing to give. My response was a single page. I told him I had received the letter and I was not in a position to engage with an apology that arrived alongside a mention of the Deli's difficulties, because the proximity of those two things told me something about the nature of the contact. I told him I was open to a relationship conducted with honesty and without pretense, meaning one that acknowledged what had happened rather than moving past it as if it had not. I told him I did not have the capacity to maintain a connection that required me to carry his guilt as part of the ongoing arrangement. I told him this was not punishment. It was a description of what I could sustain. I signed it with my name. He did not write back. I did not expect him to, and his silence told me that the terms I had described were not terms he was prepared to meet, which confirmed that the letter he had sent in the spring had been about what he needed rather than what he was offering. I noted this and moved forward. The Deli, I learned in pieces over the following years through Patricia and the occasional mutual acquaintance, went through a sustained period of difficulty under Tyler's management. The morning prep quality declined, the regular customer base thinned, and Dennis's step back from daily operations became a full withdrawal within 18 months. By the time I was finishing my 3rd year at Hartfield, Hollis Deli on Prospect Avenue had reduced its hours to 4 days a week. I have no detailed knowledge of where things stand now because I have not sought it out. The Deli was Dennis's plan for my life, not mine, and I stopped tracking the outcomes of plans that were never mine to begin with. Patricia comes to Pittsburgh twice a year. She drives herself, and we meet at a restaurant near the river that we chose the first time because it had parking, and have returned to ever since out of the simple inertia of a tradition that works. We order food and we talk about her work and my rotations and the things happening in both our lives that exist in the present rather than the past. We have not had a formal conversation about February in the Deli kitchen, and I do not anticipate that we will. What we have instead is this: these twice-yearly dinners, the river visible through the window, the conversation that stays in the current season. It is not everything. It is real, and it is what she is able to offer. And I have decided that what is real and honestly given is worth more than what is performed and expected. Gerald Webb retired from USPS in April of last year after 32 years of service. His retirement party was held on a Saturday afternoon at a hall in the western Cleveland neighborhood where he had lived for most of his adult life, organized by his wife and the colleagues from his distribution center and the people from the routes he had walked for 3 decades. I drove back from Pittsburgh that morning, 4 hours on the highway, with the windows down and the early spring weather still deciding what it wanted to be, and arrived at the hall 40 minutes before the party began. I sat beside him at the main table. His wife, a woman named Donna, who had the warm, unhurried manner of someone who had spent 32 years listening to stories about other people's mail and found them genuinely interesting, sat on his other side. A regional supervisor from the USPS district office presented Gerald with a framed 32-year service certificate and said a few words about reliability and community and the kind of quiet dedication that holds a neighborhood together without asking for recognition. Gerald accepted the certificate with the same composure he brought to everything: a brief nod, a thank you, his hands steady. When the supervisor finished and the room had settled back into its general conversation, someone near the front table asked if anyone else wanted to say a few words. I stood up. I did not have notes. I had thought about what I wanted to say on the drive down, and I knew it already. I said that most people in this room knew Gerald as someone who delivered the mail. I said I knew him as someone who understood that delivering the mail and delivering something more than the mail were not always the same thing, and that Gerald had never confused the two. I said that 6 years ago he had taken a 40-mile drive on his day off to make sure that a piece of correspondence reached the person it was intended for, that the drive had required no authorization and no reimbursement, and had been done entirely out of the conviction that something had gone wrong and he was in a position to help correct it. I said that the correspondence in question was a medical school acceptance letter, and that I was the intended recipient, and that I was standing in a Pittsburgh hospital 2 nights a week working emergency medicine cases because Gerald Webb had paid attention on his route and had not been willing to let what he knew go unaddressed. I said some people deliver mail. Some people deliver something that cannot be weighed or sorted or bundled with a rubber band. Then I sat down. The room laughed first at the image of bundling something like that. Then it went quiet in the way a room goes quiet when a true thing has been said plainly and the people in it are taking a moment to register what they heard. Gerald looked at the table for a moment and then looked at me and nodded once, which was the Gerald Webb equivalent of a great deal more. The drive back to Pittsburgh that evening took 4 hours and 10 minutes. I listened to a medicine podcast for the first hour and then turned it off and drove in quiet and thought about a deli on Prospect Avenue and a mail slot and the specific weight of a 9x12 envelope and how many points a life can turn on without your knowledge until the turning has already happened. The framed letter is still on my wall. The torn envelope is still in my drawer. Dennis's 4 sentences are in the folder behind it. I do not look at any of them often. I do not need to. The facts they represent are part of the structure of how I got here. And here is where I am. And here is enough. If there is anything I have understood from the distance of 7 years, it is this. The door was never closed. Someone tried to tell me it was, and I believed them long enough for the belief to cost me nearly a year of my life. But the door was always open. It was always open because the work I had done was real, and real work does not disappear because someone burns the paper that confirms it. What Gerald Webb did was not create an opportunity. He corrected a record. The opportunity had been mine from the beginning. You do not need permission from the person who tried to erase you to become exactly who you were always going to be. You only need one person somewhere along the way who pays enough attention to make sure the letter gets through. If this story stayed with you, please share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Like this video, leave a comment below telling us where you are watching from, and subscribe to Sophia Told Stories for more. We have more stories like this one waiting for you, and every single one of them is about what happens when people refuse to be erased. Elizabeth's story is not really about a letter. It is about something that a letter cannot contain and a kitchen sink fire cannot destroy. It is about the difference between a record of your work and the work itself. Dennis Hollis burned the paper. He could not burn the 4 years of pre-dawn studying, the 89th percentile MCAT score, the organic chemistry hours at the deli counter, the biology lab reports with Mrs. Whitfield's red ink in the margin. He could delay the outcome. He could not erase what produced it. There is a specific kind of damage that comes from being told a door is closed when it was never closed at all. You stop walking toward it. You reorganize your life around the assumption of a wall. And the most painful part is not the lie itself, but the time you spend inside it, the months you give to a false version of your own story. Elizabeth gave 7 months to that version. Then Gerald Webb drove 40 miles on his day off and handed her the truth through the door of her father's deli. The lesson is not that someone will always come to correct the record. Sometimes they will not come. The lesson is that your work is yours, regardless of whether anyone acknowledges it, and that the people most worth keeping in your life are the ones who pay attention without being asked, who notice when something is wrong and act without requiring permission or reward. You do not need the approval of someone who tried to limit you in order to become what you were always capable of becoming. You need the work. You need the time. And sometimes you need one person, somewhere, who refuses to let the wrong address be the final one. If this story reached you today, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe to Sophia Told Stories, leave a comment below, and come back for the next one. Every story we tell here is about someone who refused to stay erased.